Night makes the present feel thinner, as if the day has finally stepped back and left the room. In that quiet space, the mind does something ancient. It looks up, even with eyes closed, and tries to remember what the sky once meant. Before screens and clocks, the heavens were the first archive. Patterns were tracked patiently, not to impress anyone, but to survive. A delayed season, a strange light, an unexpected visitor. These were not trivia. They were pressure changes in the story of the world. So let the modern noise soften for a moment. Let the breathing slow, and let a single question drift closer, not with urgency, but with steady curiosity, as if it has been waiting a very long time to be asked. Since the appearance of 3I Atlas, a new question has emerged. Not because the object answered anything, but because it reminded researchers how rarely humanity notices what enters our cosmic neighborhood from unexpected trajectories. A sky can look familiar for a lifetime and still hold surprises that arrive without permission. If this series has been speaking to you in the quiet hours, you can subscribe in the same quiet way, like leaving a small lantern lit at the edge of time so you can return when the next chapter begins. Long before telescopes, satellites, or modern astronomy, early cultures observed the sky with intense attention. They did not observe it as a hobby. They watched it as a living calendar, a negotiation with seasons, and sometimes as a judge that could change its mind. When the sky changed, the ground changed. When the sky behaved oddly, leaders and priests and record-keepers felt the weight of interpretation. Among these watchers, the Sumerians left some of the earliest written records of celestial signs linked to disruption, collapse, and renewal. Their tablets are not simply poems. They are administrative memory, legal memory, ritual memory, and occasionally a kind of atmospheric logbook. This is where modern confusion often begins, because we want the past to speak in the language of the present. We want coordinates, orbital elements, and clear labels. The past rarely offers those. What it offers instead is sequence, the order in which things happened, and the emotional gravity attached to certain patterns. These records are often associated with the Anunnaki, not as aliens or gods in the modern sense, but as figures connected to warnings, decisions, and cycles. In the oldest layers, their presence can read like a governing council, a framework for authority that blends the divine with the civic. They preside over order, but also over the moments when order fails, when something must be judged, corrected, or restarted. That does not mean a specific object was named and tracked in the way a modern observatory would track it. It means the sky was treated as a domain where messages could arrive and where consequences were expected. In this chapter of the 3I Atlas series, we are not claiming that the Anunnaki predicted this object. We are asking a more careful question. Do ancient texts preserve memories of celestial warnings similar to the pattern we observe today? The distinction matters. Prediction is sharp and risky, and it tempts exaggeration. Memory is softer and sometimes more reliable in its own way. A memory can survive even when details erode, because what endures is the structure of the event, the feeling of it, and the lessons it forced into culture. What drew attention to 3I Atlas was not a confirmation of ancient stories, but a modern reminder of scale. Space is vast, and our vigilance is recent. For most of human history, the sky was watched with bare eyes, and yet it was watched constantly. Unusual lights, strange stars, objects that seemed to appear where none had been, these were noticed. They were recorded in the language available at the time, as omens, as portents, as divine communications, as warnings, not because people were naive, but because a warning is what an unexpected sign becomes when you live close to the edge of stability, and stability is the real subject here. The ancient world was not a museum. It was a chain of fragile seasons, rival cities, unpredictable rivers, and political systems that could collapse quickly. When a culture links a sign in the sky with social disruption, it may be performing superstition, or it may be compressing experience. A generation sees something unfamiliar above, and soon after, It experiences a flood, a famine, a war, or a sudden change in the world it thought it understood. The sky becomes the first page in the record because it was the first thing they saw change. As we move forward, we will stay grounded. We will read what the texts actually say, and we will pay attention to what they do not say. We will separate modern cravings for spectacle from ancient habits of observation, and we will keep returning to a single thread that feels strangely consistent across time. A sign, then disruption, then renewal, as if history has its own way of repeating a warning without ever repeating the same words. A sign, then disruption, then renewal. That is the thread that refuses to disappear. It appears in different costumes across cultures, but the sequence often remains. If we are trying to understand why Three-Eye Atlas revived an old question, we start there, with structure rather than certainty. Modern observers did not react to Three-Eye Atlas because it carried a message. They reacted because it carried unfamiliarity. The scientific instinct is to categorize, measure, and model, yet even science feels a subtle tension when something does not fit the usual traffic patterns. Most celestial objects we track belong to families we understand. Asteroids in known belts, comets with recognizable behaviors, near-Earth objects with predictable arcs. When an object seems to arrive from an unexpected direction, or carries traits that do not neatly settle into a category, it becomes a reminder that our map is incomplete. That reminder is not fear, it is humility, and humility is very close to the emotional core of ancient sky watching. The Sumerians and their neighbors did not think the sky was a decorative ceiling. They thought it was active. They assigned it agency not because they were foolish, but because they could not afford indifference. An agricultural society lives under a constant negotiation with weather and water. A river that rises too high or not high enough becomes a political event. A season that shifts becomes a moral crisis. It is within that context that the sky becomes meaningful. So when ancient texts describe unusual celestial signs, we should resist the modern urge to translate them into modern objects too quickly. A record of a bright star, a wandering light, a strange halo, a sudden darkness could refer to many phenomena. Some may be atmospheric, some may be astronomical, some may be symbolic. The value is not always in the precise identification. The value is in what the culture felt was important enough to write down, and how it linked that sign to events that followed. This is where the Anunnaki enter the narrative, not as visitors from elsewhere, but as a conceptual apparatus for decision-making. In many Sumerian traditions, divine assemblies reflect human assemblies. Council is gathered, decrees are made, fates are weighed. When the sky gives a sign, the world below is imagined as entering a deliberative moment. Something is being assessed. Something may be allowed or restrained or corrected. That mental model can be read as mythology, but it can also be read as an early method for framing risk, a way to prepare the society for change by placing that change within a story of order and consequence. What do the texts actually say? They often speak in patterns, not in technical descriptions. A sign appears, the mood shifts, leaders consult, rituals are performed, and then a disruption follows. Sometimes a flood, sometimes conflict, sometimes a fall of a city, sometimes a renewal that involves new kingship or a restored harmony. The narrative does not always claim the sign caused the disruption. Sometimes it suggests the sign announced it. That is a crucial difference. Announcement implies observation, an attempt to read the world's signals. Causation implies mechanism. Ancient texts often live closer to observation than we assume. In the modern world, we have mechanisms. We have impact models, climate models, orbital calculations. Yet we still recognize that a warning is not always a guarantee. A warning is a probability shaped into attention. In that sense, an ancient omen and a modern risk assessment are not as distant as they appear. Both are ways of saying, pay attention, because the future is not obligated to remain calm. This is why we will treat the Sumerian material with care. We will not force it to carry claims it never made. We will look for where the sky is mentioned in proximity to instability. We will watch how the texts describe consultation and decision. And we will ask whether the sequence, sign, disruption, renewal might preserve a memory of real episodes that were never fully understood, but never fully forgotten either, waiting quietly in the archive until a modern object like 3i Atlas makes the old pattern feel visible again. That feeling of visibility is subtle, almost uncomfortable. It is the sensation that something old has been reactivated, not as belief, but as awareness. When modern researchers look back at ancient records after an event like 3i Atlas, they are not searching for confirmation. They are searching for precedent. Has humanity been here before, standing beneath a calm sky, suddenly reminded that calm is not a permanent state? To answer that, we have to slow down and read the Sumerian material as it was meant to be read, not as a single narrative, but as layers accumulated over centuries. These texts were not written to impress future readers. They were written to stabilize the present. They include hymns, administrative lists, kingly chronicles, ritual instructions, and omens. The references to the sky are scattered among these categories, which already tells us something important. Celestial signs were not isolated curiosities. They were woven into daily governance, religion, and memory. When a tablet mentions an unusual star or a disturbance in the heavens, it is often followed by language of concern rather than wonder. The tone is rarely celebratory. Instead, it carries a sense of vigilance. Something has been noticed, and now attention must be redirected. This aligns closely with how modern institutions react to anomalies. An unexpected data point does not cause panic, but it does trigger review, discussion, and preparation. In that sense, the ancient response feels surprisingly familiar. The Anunnaki appear most clearly in this context of oversight. They are invoked at moments when balance is threatened or when decisions must be made that affect more than one generation. In later interpretations, they become exaggerated, dramatized, turned into beings with distinct personalities and conflicts. But in the earliest layers, they function more like a governing principle. They represent the idea that order is maintained through attention and that neglect invites correction. This matters because it reframes the question of celestial warnings. The texts are not saying that a god hurled disaster from the sky. They are saying that when the sky changed in an unfamiliar way, it was understood as a signal that the existing order might no longer be sufficient. Preparations followed. Rituals intensified. Leadership was questioned. In some cases, the disruption arrived anyway. In others, renewal followed through reform rather than catastrophe. We also need to acknowledge what the texts do not preserve. They do not give us trajectories, velocities, or impact sites. They do not describe explosions in the sky with cinematic clarity. What they preserve instead is memory compressed into meaning. A sign was seen. It mattered. Life changed afterward. Over generations, the details blurred, but the structure remained intact because the structure was the lesson. This is where modern discomfort begins. We prefer specificity. We want to know exactly what happened. Ancient memory does not always cooperate. It offers patterns instead of measurements. And yet, patterns are how large systems are often understood. Climate is not a single storm. It is a rhythm. Risk is not a single event. It is a distribution. Ancient cultures, without equations, learned to think in rhythms because their survival depended on it. So when similar sequences appear in different cultures, separated by geography but linked by agriculture and river systems, it raises a quiet question. Were these independent inventions of myth, or were they responses to shared experiences with a volatile planet and a dynamic sky? The answer does not require aliens or advanced technology. It requires only that humanity has been paying attention for a very long time. As we move deeper, we will expand beyond Sumer, not to dilute the focus, but to test it. If the pattern holds elsewhere, the question shifts again, not toward prediction, but toward inheritance. What kinds of events leave marks deep enough to echo across civilizations? And why do those echoes tend to begin with the sky? The sky becomes the opening line because it is the one thing no society can control. Rivers can be redirected, fields can be terraced, cities can be fortified. But whatever moves above arrives on its own terms. That uncontrollability is what gives celestial signs their authority across cultures. They are not issued by rivals or rulers. They are noticed, and once noticed, they demand interpretation. In Mesopotamia, this interpretive process became formalized over time. By the second millennium BCE, scholars were compiling omen series that linked specific celestial phenomena with potential outcomes on Earth. These were not wild prophecies. They were structured observations, built from accumulated experience. A certain configuration appeared, and in the past, instability followed. The record does not say the sky caused the event. It says the sky and the event were associated closely enough to be remembered together. This is an important distinction because it aligns closely with modern thinking about risk signals. Today, scientists monitor indicators that correlate with future disruption. A pressure change does not cause a storm, but it warns of one. A fault line does not cause an earthquake by being mapped, but mapping it changes how seriously the threat is taken. Ancient omen texts functioned in a similar way. They translated observation into preparedness, even if the language was symbolic. Within these records, references to divine counsels and decrees can be read as metaphors for decision-making under uncertainty. When the Anunnaki are said to deliberate, it reflects a cultural understanding that some outcomes are not immediate or obvious. There is a pause between the sign and the result. That pause is filled with assessment, ritual, and adjustment. The presence of that pause is evidence of restraint, not superstition. It suggests an attempt to manage anxiety by structuring it. What stands out is how often these celestial signs precede narratives of correction rather than annihilation. Floods appear, but so do restorations. Cities fall, but kingship is renewed. Humanity is not erased. It is recalibrated. This supports the idea that these stories preserve memories of survival through disruption, not just fear of destruction. A warning in this context is not an end. It is an opportunity to adapt. When viewed this way, the connection to Three-Eye Atlas becomes clearer. The modern reaction was not panic, but attention. Telescopes turned, models were run, discussions unfolded. Nothing catastrophic followed, but the reminder remained. There are things we do not routinely see, and their appearance forces us to confront the limits of our awareness. That confrontation is ancient. Across cultures, similar confrontations appear at moments when societies feel stretched thin. Environmental stress, population pressure, political instability, these conditions make celestial signs feel heavier, more charged. The sky does not change its behavior because humans are anxious, but human interpretation sharpens under strain. A rare object in the heavens becomes meaningful because the ground below is already uncertain. This is why the question is not whether ancient people knew more than we do, but whether they remembered differently. They encoded experience into stories that could survive long after the data was lost. Those stories were not precise, but they were resilient. And resilience, more than accuracy, is what allows memory to travel across millennia, waiting for a moment when a modern observer looks up and feels an unexpected sense of recognition. That sense of recognition is quiet, almost reluctant. It does not arrive as revelation, but as alignment. A modern observer reads an ancient line and feels that it fits, not perfectly but meaningfully, into a pattern that is already familiar. This is where the discussion must remain careful, because recognition can easily slide into projection. The task is not to impose modern anxieties onto ancient words, but to let the ancient framework challenge how we think about warning and response. One of the most revealing aspects of the Sumerian material is how rarely it isolates a single cause. Disruption is usually presented as the result of imbalance rather than intrusion. Human behavior, environmental stress, divine displeasure, and celestial signs appear together, not competing, but converging. This convergence suggests a worldview in which the sky is not an external threat, but part of an integrated system. When the system shifts, all levels respond. In that system, the Anunnaki function as custodians of balance. They do not create chaos on a whim. They react to accumulated strain. In some texts, humanity's noise, metaphorical or literal, becomes too great. In others, the land is described as overburdened. These descriptions can be read symbolically, but they also mirror real conditions in early urban societies. Overpopulation, irrigation problems, salinization of soil, and political rivalry were genuine stresses. A celestial sign appearing during such times would naturally be interpreted as confirmation that something had reached a threshold. This reframing helps explain why floods occupy such a central place in these narratives. A flood is not only a physical event, it is the ultimate reset in a river-based civilization. It erases boundaries, dissolves ownership, and forces rebuilding. When flood stories are paired with celestial warnings, the implication is not that the sky caused the water to rise, but that the sky signaled that the existing order was no longer stable enough to withstand what was coming. Importantly, these stories also preserve dissent. Not all humans are destroyed. Some are warned. Some are preserved. This introduces an ethical dimension. A warning implies responsibility. If a sign is seen and understood, then inaction becomes a choice. The presence of survivors suggests that ancient cultures believed attentiveness mattered. Those who listened endured. Those who ignored perished. Whether literal or symbolic, that message is consistent. In the context of Three-Eye Atlas, this ethical layer is easy to overlook. Nothing happened. Life continued. But the story is not over because nothing happened. The story is about what attention does to a civilization. Do we notice rare events? Do we record them carefully? Do we integrate them into long-term thinking? Or do we dismiss them once the immediate tension passes? Ancient cultures chose memory. They wrote, repeated, ritualized, and taught these sequences until they became part of identity. We choose data, storage, and models. Both are forms of memory. The difference is not intelligence, but orientation. Ancient memory looked backward to protect the future. Modern memory often looks forward and assumes the past has already been solved. As this chapter continues, the focus will widen, not to escape Sumer, but to test whether this pattern of warning, disruption, and renewal truly belongs to one culture, or whether it reflects a shared human response to living under a sky that has never promised permanence. A shared response implies shared conditions. For early civilizations, those conditions were remarkably similar despite distance. Rivers, seasonal cycles, and narrow margins between abundance and collapse defined daily life. When we look beyond Sumer, we begin to see how easily the same narrative structure could emerge without direct contact, because the pressures shaping it were universal. In Egypt, the sky was also treated as a register of order and disruption. Unusual celestial events were noted in relation to the stability of kingship and the health of the land. The flooding of the Nile, normally predictable and life-giving, became ominous when it deviated from expectation. While Egyptian texts differ in tone from Mesopotamian ones, often emphasizing continuity over rupture, the underlying concern is the same. When the sky behaves unexpectedly, balance is at risk. Further east, in early Chinese records, celestial phenomena were explicitly linked to the moral standing of rulers. Eclipses, comets, and unusual stars were recorded meticulously, not because they were beautiful, but because they were believed to signal the need for correction. The mandate of heaven was not a guarantee. It was conditional. A sign in the sky suggested that the condition was under review. This is not superstition in the shallow sense. It is a political technology built on observation. Across the ocean in Mesoamerica, the sky structured time itself. Calendars were synchronized with celestial cycles, and deviations were treated with gravity. While the cultural language was different, the pattern remains. A sign appears. Ritual intensifies. Change follows. Sometimes that change is destructive. Sometimes it is renewing. What matters is the consistency of the sequence. This cross-cultural recurrence is what unsettles researchers, not because it proves a single cause, but because it suggests that certain kinds of events leave similar psychological and cultural traces. A rare object in the sky, especially one that appears suddenly or behaves oddly, captures attention in a way few terrestrial events can. It arrives without warning, resists control, and forces interpretation. The mid-video line deserves to be said clearly here. What unsettles researchers is not the idea of ancient gods. It is the possibility that these stories preserve memories of real events humanity could not yet explain. That statement does not demand belief. It demands patience. Memory does not need to be accurate to be meaningful. It needs only to be persistent. If these memories exist, they would not survive as technical reports. They would survive as stories structured to be retold. They would simplify cause, compress time, and personify forces, because those are the tools of endurance. Over centuries, the original trigger might fade, but the sequence would remain. Sign, disruption, renewal, passed along because it continued to resonate with lived experience. At this point, the question evolves again. We are no longer asking whether ancient texts describe a specific object like Three-Eye Atlas. We are asking whether humanity has repeatedly encountered moments when the sky forced a reassessment of stability. If so, then modern detection systems are not a break from the past. They are an extension of a very old habit. In the next movement of this chapter, we will return to the flood narratives themselves, not as isolated myths, but as converging testimonies. The aim will not be to merge them into one story, but to observe how consistently they appear after celestial concern, as if the memory of water rising has been anchored to the memory of the sky changing, generation after generation. Generation after generation, the memory of water rising seems to cling to the memory of the sky changing. This pairing is so persistent that it invites a different kind of attention, one less focused on identifying a single catastrophic moment and more interested in understanding why floods became the chosen language of reset across so many cultures. In Mesopotamia, flood narratives are layered and evolving. Early versions speak of divine deliberation, warning, and preservation. Later versions emphasize moral failure and correction. What remains constant is the sense that the flood is not random. It follows assessment. It follows a period in which signs were visible and decisions were possible. This structure suggests that floods functioned as cultural symbols for consequences that unfold after neglect, not as impulsive acts of destruction. From a geological perspective, floods were frequent and devastating in early river civilizations. Seasonal inundation was life-sustaining, but extreme flooding erased settlements and reshaped landscapes. Over centuries, these experiences would naturally be woven into collective memory. When an unusual celestial event preceded or coincided with such flooding, even by chance, the association would be powerful enough to endure. The sky would become the opening chapter, not because it caused the water, but because it framed the event as part of a larger order. This framing allowed societies to survive psychologically as well as physically. A disaster with no meaning fractures memory. A disaster with a narrative can be carried forward. The involvement of the Anunnaki or other divine figures provided a vocabulary for processing loss without dissolving trust in the world entirely. If destruction followed deliberation, then renewal could follow destruction. The cycle remained intact. What is often overlooked is how restrained these narratives are. They do not celebrate the flood, they mourn it. They emphasize the burden of survival and the responsibility of those who are spared. The survivor is not a hero by strength alone. The survivor is attentive, warned, and compliant with the logic of preservation. This again reinforces the central role of warning, not punishment. Seen through this lens, celestial signs become part of an ethical system. They are not guarantees of safety or doom. They are invitations to adjust. Whether adjustment is possible depends on the flexibility of the society receiving the signal. Rigid systems break, adaptive ones reform. This lesson, encoded in myth, is practical at its core. When modern researchers encounter objects like Three-Eye Atlas, the relevance of these ancient patterns is not in the details, but in the response. Attention is paid, data is gathered, scenarios are discussed. Even when no threat materializes, the process itself reinforces a culture of vigilance. In that sense, we are still acting out an ancient script, only with different tools. As this chapter approaches its closing arc, the focus will shift one final time, away from texts and toward inheritance. What survives from these stories is not information about the sky itself, but a posture toward uncertainty. The sky can change, the world can follow, and between those two moments lies a narrow space where awareness matters. Awareness is the quiet inheritance these stories leave behind. Not certainty, not prophecy. Awareness shaped by repetition, by the slow accumulation of experiences that taught early societies the cost of ignoring what feels unfamiliar. Over time, that awareness hardened into tradition, and tradition into narrative, until the original triggers no longer mattered as much as the posture they produced. This posture is visible in how ancient cultures treated time. They did not see history as a straight line. They saw it as a sequence of calibrations. Periods of order expanded, strained, and then corrected. The sky served as an external reference point, a reminder that the system humans lived within was larger than any single city or ruler. When something unexpected appeared above, it suggested that the calibration might be shifting again. In that sense, the Anunnaki can be understood as symbolic custodians of thresholds. They appear when something is about to change, not necessarily because they cause it, but because the culture needed a way to mark the transition. Thresholds are uncomfortable places. They are moments when old rules lose clarity and new ones have not yet formed. By personifying this process, ancient societies made it navigable. What Three-Eye Atlas reintroduced into modern consciousness is not fear, but that same threshold awareness. For a brief period, attention turned outward. Questions were asked. Assumptions were tested. Then, as no immediate consequence followed, attention began to drift back inward, toward routine. This oscillation between vigilance and forgetting is not new. It is one of the oldest human rhythms. The risk is not that the sky will surprise us again. The sky has always been capable of that. The risk is that without narrative continuity, each surprise feels isolated, disconnected from long-term understanding. Ancient stories prevented that isolation by linking events into sequences that could be remembered even when details were lost. As we prepare to move into the next chapter of the Three-Eye Atlas series, this becomes the central question. Not whether a specific object was recorded in antiquity, but whether humanity has repeatedly been offered warnings in forms it could perceive, even if it could not fully explain them. If so, then the real inheritance is not knowledge, but responsibility. In the next chapter, we will examine the Great Flood itself, not as a single myth or location, but as a global pattern that appears after similar celestial concern. The aim will not be to prove a cause, but to understand why so many cultures chose water as the language of reset, and what that choice reveals about how humanity remembers the moments when the sky seemed to speak first. The sky speaking first is an idea that becomes clearer when we examine how floods are positioned within broader cultural memory. They are rarely presented as sudden, inexplicable accidents. Instead, they arrive after a period of unease, as if the world itself had been signaling strain before releasing it. This sequencing matters because it suggests that floods were remembered not only as natural disasters, but as culminations. When scholars compare flood narratives globally, they often focus on differences. Dates, names, geography, and scale vary widely. Yet beneath those differences lies a shared logic. A society experiences pressure. Signs appear that something is misaligned. Then comes a rupture that clears space for reorganization. The flood becomes the physical expression of that rupture, dramatic enough to justify why the world afterward is not the same as the world before. In Mesopotamia, the flood resets kingship. In Egypt, disorder threatens Mayat, the cosmic balance, before order is restored. In the Hebrew tradition, moral failure precedes cleansing. In South Asia, cycles of creation and dissolution are embedded into cosmic time itself. These are not copies of a single story. They are variations on a response to instability that feels both environmental and existential. What is striking is how often the flood is paired with preservation. A vessel, a refuge, a chosen group, or a protected lineage appears. This detail is crucial. It means the narrative is not about total annihilation. It is about continuity under threat. Something is carried through the rupture, ensuring that memory itself survives the reset. Without that continuity, the story could not exist. From a scientific perspective, we know that large floods have occurred repeatedly in human history. Meltwater pulses, river avulsions, sea level rise, and extreme rainfall events have reshaped landscapes and displaced populations. These processes do not require celestial triggers to occur, yet their timing, impact, and unpredictability would have made them feel overwhelming, especially when preceded by unusual signs in the environment. This brings us back to the role of the sky. Ancient observers did not separate Earth and heaven into unrelated systems. A change above and a disaster below were part of the same reality. If an unfamiliar object appeared in the sky before a flood, even by coincidence, the association would be remembered because it provided a narrative anchor. The sky became the signal that something larger than human control was unfolding. In modern terms, we might call this pattern recognition under uncertainty. The human mind seeks coherence, especially after trauma. Ancient narratives offered that coherence by linking disparate events into a sequence that could be retold and taught. Over time, the original data points faded, but the structure endured because it continued to make sense of vulnerability. As we continue, the task will be to hold two truths at once. Ancient flood stories are not scientific reports, but they are not meaningless either. They are memory technologies designed to carry forward lessons about fragility, preparedness, and renewal. And those lessons remain relevant whenever the sky reminds us, even briefly, that stability is conditional. Stability being conditional is a realization that rarely arrives gently. It settles slowly, often only after repetition has done its work. This is why flood narratives persist, even when societies change languages, borders, and belief systems. They are not clinging to a past event as much as they are preserving a warning about the future. When ancient scribes recorded these stories, they were not attempting to freeze history. They were compressing experience. A flood might occur once in several lifetimes, but its consequences would echo for generations. Land boundaries shifted, population centers moved, power structures collapsed and reformed. These transformations required explanation, and the explanation needed to be durable. By embedding the event within a sequence that began with celestial unease, cultures ensured the lesson would not be forgotten when the physical evidence washed away. This durability is what makes the narratives difficult to read with modern expectations. We want dates. We want mechanisms. We want to know exactly what happened and why. Ancient memory resists that demand. It offers something else instead. It offers orientation. It teaches how to behave when certainty dissolves. Pay attention. Consult. Prepare. Preserve what matters. Accept that renewal may require loss. The association with the sky reinforces this orientation. Celestial phenomena are distant, uncontrollable, and impartial. They do not negotiate. By tying disruption to the heavens, ancient cultures externalized responsibility while internalizing response. The sky did not punish because it was angry. It warned because it existed beyond human influence. That distinction allowed societies to maintain humility without surrendering agency. In this context, the Anunnaki and similar figures across cultures function less as characters and more as placeholders for process. They stand in for deliberation, threshold, and consequence. Their presence marks the moment when continuation is no longer automatic. Something must change, even if the nature of that change is not yet clear. This framing transforms catastrophe into transition. When modern researchers reflect on objects like 3I Atlas, the relevance of these ancient frameworks becomes apparent. The object itself does not threaten civilization. What it threatens is complacency. It reminds us that our awareness is bounded, that detection is recent, and that surprise is inevitable. Ancient narratives prepared societies psychologically for that reality, even if they lacked the tools to analyze it scientifically. As this examination deepens, the focus will shift once more, from floods as memory to cycles as interpretation. The question is no longer whether these stories describe one event or many, but whether they reflect an enduring human attempt to live within a world that periodically reminds its inhabitants that permanence is an illusion. Permanence being an illusion is not a conclusion ancient cultures feared. It was an assumption they quietly carried. Cities were built knowing they could fall. Dynasties ruled knowing their legitimacy was temporary. Within that worldview, cycles were not abstract ideas. They were practical expectations shaped by observation. This cyclical thinking appears repeatedly in how ancient texts frame time itself. Rather than progressing endlessly forward, history bends, returns, and corrects. Periods of expansion are followed by contraction. Order accumulates, strains, and is reset. The flood is one expression of this logic, but not the only one. Droughts, invasions, and internal collapse also occupy similar narrative roles. What distinguishes the flood is its totality. It affects everyone, regardless of status. Celestial signs fit naturally into this cyclical framework because they, too, move in patterns. Stars rise and fall. Planets wander and return. Eclipses disappear and reappear across generations. Even without understanding the mechanics, ancient observers recognized repetition. When something broke that repetition, when a light appeared where none was expected, or followed a path that felt wrong, it signaled a disruption in the cycle itself. This is why such events carried weight beyond curiosity. They suggested that the familiar rhythm had been interrupted. In a world governed by cycles, interruption implies consequence. The response was not to panic, but to prepare. Rituals intensified. Authority was questioned or reaffirmed. Memory was sharpened. These actions were not passive. They were attempts to realign with a system that had momentarily revealed its instability. The modern tendency is to dismiss this as symbolic thinking, separate from reality. Yet symbolic thinking is how humans manage complexity. It allows large, slow processes to be grasped without constant measurement. Ancient cycles were not wrong because they lacked equations. They were adaptive because they trained societies to expect change and to interpret warning as part of survival. In the case of 3I Atlas, the cycle was not completed. There was a sign, but no disruption followed. That incomplete sequence is precisely why it unsettled some observers. It reminded us of a familiar opening without delivering the expected continuation. Ancient cultures would have recognized this tension. A sign without consequence does not erase the warning. It postpones it. As we move forward, the narrative will turn toward how incomplete cycles were handled in ancient memory. Not every sign was followed by catastrophe. Some were recorded and set aside, waiting to be understood later. These moments of suspended meaning are often overlooked, yet they may reveal the most about how ancient societies lived with uncertainty under a sky that never guaranteed resolution. Suspended meaning is uncomfortable, but it is also familiar. Ancient societies lived with far more unresolved signals than resolved ones. Not every omen culminated in disaster. Not every warning unfolded into visible consequence. Many signs were simply noted, archived, and left open, their significance deferred rather than dismissed. This archival instinct is easy to underestimate. To record something without fully understanding it requires discipline. It means accepting that explanation may belong to a future generation. In Mesopotamia, this impulse appears in the careful preservation of omen lists and astronomical diaries. Observations were copied and recopied, not because their meaning was clear, but because their recurrence mattered. A sign that did not resolve once might resolve later, when circumstances aligned. This practice mirrors modern scientific caution more than we often admit. Data is stored long before patterns are recognized. An anomaly may sit unexplained for decades before new tools or new contexts make sense of it. Ancient record keepers operated under similar constraints, with fewer instruments but comparable patience. Their archives were not static. They were accumulative, designed to outlast individual lifetimes. In this light, celestial warnings in ancient texts take on a quieter role. They are not alarms demanding immediate reaction. They are markers, placeholders in a long sequence of attention. When disruption followed, the sign gained clarity in retrospect. When it did not, the sign remained, unresolved but not erased. This approach prevented both panic and forgetfulness, a balance that modern systems still struggle to achieve. The figure of the Anunnaki fits into this logic as well. Their deliberations often stretch across time, implying that outcomes are not instant. Decisions unfold gradually. Consequences may be delayed. This narrative patience reflects lived reality. Environmental stress accumulates. Political tension builds. A single moment rarely explains collapse. Ancient stories preserved this slow causality by embedding it within divine time. What makes this relevant to the present is not the content of the stories, but their restraint. They do not claim certainty where none exists. They allow for waiting. They acknowledge that meaning may emerge only after repetition. In a world where attention cycles are increasingly short, this ancient posture feels almost foreign. When 3-Eye Atlas appeared, it created a brief moment of suspended meaning. The object was noted, analyzed, and then, as no immediate consequence followed, gradually folded into the background of knowledge. Ancient cultures would have recognized this moment not as failure, but as incompletion. A chapter opened, but not closed. As we continue, the focus will turn toward how such incompletions accumulate. When many unresolved signs stack over time, they begin to shape expectation. The sky does not need to act dramatically to influence human behavior. Sometimes the quiet memory of previous warnings is enough to change how a civilization listens when the next sign appears. Expectation shaped by memory is a powerful force. It operates quietly, beneath conscious belief, influencing how societies interpret new information long before conclusions are drawn. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. The accumulation of unresolved signs did not create fear. It created vigilance. In Mesopotamia, vigilance became institutional. Specialists were trained to watch the sky, record anomalies, and compare them with earlier entries. This was not mystical obsession. It was administrative foresight. A sign did not command action on its own. It entered a ledger of possibility where its meaning could evolve as conditions changed. Over time, this practice created a culture that treated uncertainty as something to manage, not something to deny. This management of uncertainty is where ancient and modern worlds quietly align. Today, risk assessment does not depend on single events. It depends on patterns, probabilities, and memory. A rare object like 3-Eye Atlas matters not because it is dangerous, but because it contributes to an expanding understanding of what is possible. Each new data point reshapes expectation, just as each recorded omen reshaped ancient awareness. What differs is the language used to carry that awareness forward. Ancient cultures relied on narrative continuity. Stories, rituals, and symbolic figures ensured that lessons survived long after the original observers were gone. Modern societies rely on institutions, databases, and models. Both approaches serve the same function. They prevent surprise from becoming shock. The Anunnaki, viewed through this lens, are not predictors of specific events. They are reminders that oversight exists, whether divine or institutional. Someone is watching. Someone is weighing outcomes. Someone is responsible for noticing thresholds. This idea reduces chaos by asserting that events unfold within a framework, even if that framework is not fully understood. This is why the texts rarely express panic. Even in the face of floods and collapse, the tone is measured. Loss is acknowledged, but meaning is preserved. The world ends for some, but not for all. Continuity survives through adaptation. That message, repeated across generations, builds resilience rather than despair. When we apply this perspective to the present, the relevance becomes clear. Objects like 3i Atlas do not need to fulfill ancient narratives to matter. Their role is to refresh awareness. They remind us that vigilance is not a temporary state activated by crisis, but a long-term posture shaped by memory. As this chapter advances, the remaining task is interpretive rather than descriptive. We will look at how cycles, warnings, and renewals have been read in both literal and symbolic ways, and why maintaining that ambiguity may be the most faithful way to engage with ancient memory without forcing it to speak in modern terms it never used. Ambiguity is not a flaw in ancient memory. It is one of its strengths. By allowing multiple readings, these narratives remained flexible enough to survive changing conditions without losing relevance. A story that insists on a single interpretation risks becoming obsolete. A story that preserves structure while allowing meaning to shift can endure. This flexibility is evident in how flood narratives and celestial warnings have been reinterpreted across eras. In some periods, they were read literally as records of divine intervention. In others, they were treated symbolically as moral lessons or political metaphors. Neither reading erased the other. They coexisted, reinforcing the idea that the value of the story was not confined to one level of meaning. Modern scholarship often attempts to resolve this ambiguity by choosing sides. Either the stories are factual records of events, or they are imaginative myths with no historical core. Ancient cultures did not require this separation. For them, meaning did not depend on exclusivity. A story could be true in function without being precise in detail. It could guide behavior without specifying mechanisms. This is particularly important when considering celestial signs. An unusual object in the sky could be experienced as a physical phenomenon, a symbolic message, and a social catalyst simultaneously. These layers did not compete. They complemented each other. The sky was both real and meaningful, observable and interpretive. In the case of 3i Atlas, modern responses also occupy multiple layers. There is the physical analysis, concerned with orbit and composition. There is the institutional response, focused on monitoring and preparedness. And there is the cultural response, quieter but present, where ancient questions resurface. None of these layers invalidates the others. What ancient texts offer is not an answer, but a model for holding these layers together without forcing resolution. They show how a society can remain grounded while acknowledging mystery. The Anunnaki, as narrative figures, embody this balance. They are neither fully abstract nor fully concrete. They exist in the space between explanation and acceptance. As this examination moves toward its final sections, the emphasis will shift from interpretation to consequence. How does a civilization change when it internalizes the idea that warnings exist, but outcomes are not guaranteed? How does it live with a sky that sometimes speaks and sometimes remains silent? The closing movement of this chapter will not attempt to solve these questions. Instead, it will reflect on what is inherited when stories of warning are passed down not as predictions, but as reminders. Reminders that attention itself may be the most enduring legacy ancient observers left behind. Attention as an inheritance is difficult to measure, but its effects are visible over long spans of time. Societies that cultivate attentiveness tend to encode it into institutions, rituals, and education. Those that do not often rediscover its importance only after disruption forces the lesson upon them. Ancient narratives of warning exist precisely at this intersection where memory is meant to outlast comfort. What these stories teach is not vigilance born of fear, but vigilance born of humility. The sky is not hostile, but it is indifferent. It does not adjust itself to human schedules or expectations. By acknowledging this indifference, ancient cultures avoided the illusion of control while preserving the capacity to respond. This balance is subtle, and it is easily lost when stories are reduced to either superstition or spectacle. The Anunnaki and similar figures represent this balanced awareness. They are not omnipotent saviors, nor are they arbitrary destroyers. They deliberate, they hesitate, they respond to accumulation rather than impulse. In narrative terms, this reflects a deep understanding of how large-scale change actually unfolds. Rarely does a single moment explain everything. Change gathers, signals, and only then expresses itself fully. This perspective reshapes how we understand the absence of catastrophe after signs like Three-Eye Atlas. From an ancient viewpoint, the lack of immediate disruption would not invalidate the significance of the sign. It would simply mean the cycle had not yet completed, or that adjustment occurred quietly, without visible rupture. Silence does not negate warning. It often accompanies it. In modern culture, silence is uncomfortable. We expect resolution. We expect conclusions. Ancient memory was more tolerant of open endings. A sign could remain meaningful without being resolved, its presence shaping expectation rather than dictating outcome. This tolerance allowed societies to remain adaptive instead of reactive. As we move further into this chapter, the narrative begins to turn inward. The question becomes less about what ancient observers saw and more about what they chose to pass on. Out of countless nights under the sky, only certain moments were remembered, only certain sequences were preserved. This selectivity reveals priorities. What was remembered was not the sky itself, but the moment when attention mattered. The final sections will consider what it means to inherit these priorities today, not as belief in ancient figures or cosmic intentions, but as continuity of posture, a willingness to notice, to record, to wait, and to accept that understanding may arrive long after observation. In that sense, the ancient watchers may be closer to us than we assume, not because they knew more, but because they remembered how little control any generation truly has under a changing sky. A changing sky has always been the quiet backdrop to human ambition. Empires rise believing themselves permanent, technologies advance promising mastery, and yet the horizon above remains largely untouched by intention. Ancient cultures understood this tension instinctively. Their stories did not emerge from ignorance, but from long familiarity with limits. They knew that observation did not grant control, only context. This context is what allowed warning narratives to remain useful even when their original causes were forgotten. A sign in the sky did not need to be explained fully to matter. Its value lay in what it activated within society. Councils were convened, records were consulted, behavior adjusted. Even if nothing dramatic followed, the act of collective attention itself reinforced cohesion. It reminded people that they were participants in a system larger than their immediate concerns. When we look closely at the Sumerian texts, we see that this collective response is often more prominent than the sign itself. The language lingers on deliberation, on the weighing of outcomes, on the responsibility of leadership. The Anunnaki appear less as sources of information and more as guarantors that the process of evaluation is legitimate. They sanction attention. They validate caution. This is a critical distinction because it prevents the narratives from becoming fatalistic. A warning does not mean an outcome is fixed. It means an outcome is possible. The space between those two ideas is where human agency exists. Ancient cultures may have expressed that space through ritual and myth, but the underlying logic is strikingly modern. Risk is acknowledged, response is chosen, consequence unfolds. In the case of floods, this logic becomes especially clear. Flooding was both inevitable and variable. No society along major rivers could avoid it entirely, but preparation could mitigate its effects. Levees, canals, and storage systems were physical responses to a known risk. Stories of warning and renewal were psychological responses to the same reality. Both were forms of infrastructure. What modern readers sometimes miss is how practical these narratives were. They were not written to explain the universe. They were written to help people endure it. By linking celestial signs to social responsibility, ancient cultures created a feedback loop. Observation led to reflection. Reflection led to adaptation. Adaptation increased survival. When an object like 3-Eye Atlas appears in the modern sky, the same loop activates, even if we do not consciously recognize it. Attention spikes. Experts consult archives of data rather than tablets. Models replace omens, yet the structure remains intact. Something unexpected appears. It is recorded. Its implications are discussed. Life continues, slightly altered by the awareness that the unexpected is real. As we approach the later movements of this chapter, the emphasis will continue to shift away from specific phenomena and toward continuity of behavior. What endures across millennia is not the memory of any single object, but the habit of watching. The sky has always changed. The question is whether the act of noticing continues to change us in return. The act of noticing is where continuity truly resides. Civilizations differ in language, belief, and technology, but the decision to pay attention to the unfamiliar has remained remarkably constant. This decision is not automatic. It must be reinforced through culture, memory, and story. Without reinforcement, familiarity dulls perception, and the unusual passes unnoticed. Ancient societies understood that attention fades unless it is trained. This is why sky watching became formalized rather than casual. Observation was ritualized, assigned, repeated. The heavens were not glanced at. They were studied patiently, night after night, generation after generation. What mattered was not excitement, but consistency. Only through consistency could deviation be recognized. Deviation is the true source of unease in these narratives. A predictable sky is reassuring even when it is harsh. An unpredictable sky challenges assumption. When ancient texts speak of fear or concern, it is rarely directed at the object itself. It is directed at the loss of expectation. Something has appeared that does not belong to the established rhythm, and that rupture demands interpretation. The Anunnaki once again occupy this interpretive space. They do not announce conclusions. They convene. Their presence signals that meaning must be constructed, not received. This detail is often overlooked, but it is essential. Ancient cultures did not imagine warnings as instructions carved in certainty. They imagined them as prompts for reflection. The future remained open, but no longer neutral. Modern science operates under a similar tension. An anomaly does not dictate outcome. It alters probability. When something like 3-Eye Atlas enters awareness, it does not rewrite models overnight. It adds weight to certain questions. It justifies further attention. It expands the boundary of what is considered possible. This expansion, though subtle, is cumulative. Over long periods, cumulative expansion changes posture. A society that repeatedly encounters reminders of uncertainty becomes more cautious, more adaptive, or more brittle, depending on how those reminders are integrated. Ancient narratives of warning were tools for integration. They helped societies metabolize uncertainty without collapsing into paralysis. What emerges from this comparison is not a claim of ancient foresight, but of ancient discipline. They did not know more. They practiced longer. Their awareness was slower, but it was sustained. They accepted that understanding unfolds across lifetimes, not moments. As this chapter continues toward its conclusion, the remaining focus will be on what happens when that discipline weakens, what is lost when attention becomes episodic rather than continuous. The final blocks will reflect on forgetting, not as failure of intelligence, but as a natural consequence of comfort, and on why the sky has so often been the medium through which that comfort is interrupted. Comfort has a way of narrowing perception. When systems appear stable, attention relaxes, and vigilance becomes selective. Ancient cultures recognized this pattern long before it was named. Periods of prosperity were often followed by stories of neglect. not because abundance was wrong, but because it encouraged forgetting. The sky, constant yet distant, became easy to ignore until it offered a reason not to be. Many ancient warnings are framed not as sudden revelations, but as interruptions of routine. A light appears where none is expected. A cycle fails to repeat precisely. These moments break the illusion that the present order is guaranteed. They do not arrive to punish comfort, but to expose its fragility. In this way, the sky functions less as a messenger and more as a mirror, reflecting the limits of human assumption. Forgetting, then, is not portrayed as ignorance. It is portrayed as drift. Attention slowly shifts inward, toward immediate concerns, while larger patterns fade into background noise. Ancient narratives respond to this drift by reintroducing scale. They remind listeners that the world extends beyond the horizon of the present, and that forces outside human planning continue to operate regardless of belief. The Anunnaki are often invoked precisely at these moments of drift. Their role is not to overwhelm humanity with power, but to reassert perspective. They represent the idea that order requires maintenance, and that maintenance begins with awareness. When attention lapses, imbalance grows. When imbalance grows, correction follows. This sequence is not moralistic, it is systemic. Modern parallels are easy to find. Complex societies rely on layers of infrastructure that function smoothly until they do not. Failures are often preceded by warnings that were visible but deprioritized. Signals existed, but attention was elsewhere. In hindsight, the pattern appears obvious. Ancient stories compress this hindsight into narrative form, allowing future generations to recognize the shape of failure before living through it themselves. In the context of Three-Eye Atlas, the object itself is less important than the reaction it briefly produced. For a moment, attention widened. Discussions crossed disciplines. Archives were revisited. Then, as no immediate disruption followed, routine reasserted itself. From an ancient perspective, this is not resolution. It is pause. Pauses matter. They are spaces where meaning can either deepen or dissipate. Ancient cultures filled pauses with repetition, retelling, and ritual to prevent dissipation. Modern culture often fills them with distraction. The difference is not technological, it is cultural. As this chapter moves toward its final reflections, the emphasis will rest on this divergence. How different societies choose to occupy the space between warning and outcome shapes what they remember and what they lose. The sky may offer signs rarely, but forgetting does not require an external trigger. It unfolds naturally when attention is no longer practiced. Forgetting unfolds quietly, without ceremony. It does not announce itself as a loss. It feels like relief. The tension fades. The anomaly is categorized, archived, and gradually displaced by more immediate concerns. Ancient narratives understood this process well enough to warn against it without ever naming it directly. This is why many stories of warning are embedded within larger cycles rather than isolated episodes. They are meant to be encountered repeatedly, not consumed once. Each retelling refreshes awareness, reactivating attention before comfort can fully settle. In this way, myth functioned as a maintenance system for perception, not as entertainment or belief enforcement. The repetition of celestial concern across cultures suggests that the sky was one of the few domains capable of cutting through habitual blindness. Political messages could be ignored, moral exhortations could be resisted, but a change above, visible to all and owned by none, commanded shared attention. It was difficult to dismiss without consequence. The Anunnaki and similar figures across traditions serve as anchors for this shared attention. They provide continuity across retellings, ensuring that the structure of warning remains intact even as details shift. The names change, the settings change, but the moment of deliberation remains. Something is noticed, its implications are weighed. A response, or failure to respond, follows. In modern contexts, shared attention is increasingly fragmented. Objects like Three-Eye Atlas briefly unify focus, but only temporarily. The mechanisms for sustaining that focus over time are weaker. Data persists, but narrative continuity does not always follow. Without continuity, awareness becomes episodic, easily overridden by novelty. Ancient cultures compensated for this fragility by embedding memory into identity. To know who you were was to know the stories of past warnings and renewals. Forgetting those stories was not merely an intellectual lapse. It was a cultural risk. The stories existed to prevent repetition of unexamined collapse. As we approach the closing movement of this chapter, the question is no longer about ancient texts or modern objects. It is about posture. How does a society position itself in relation to uncertainty? Does it treat warnings as interruptions to be endured or as information to be integrated? The final blocks will not offer prescriptions. They will return to reflection. The sky has always changed, and it will continue to do so. What varies is not the frequency of signs, but the quality of attention brought to them. And that quality, once lost, is difficult to restore without experience forcing its return. Experience forcing attention is the outcome ancient stories hoped to prevent. They were attempts to teach without trauma, to pass on awareness without requiring repetition of loss. Whether they succeeded is an open question, but their persistence suggests that the effort itself mattered. By embedding warnings within cycles rather than isolated moments, these narratives resisted finality. There is no ultimate disaster that ends the story forever. There is only transition, correction, and continuation. This structure mirrors the reality of human history more accurately than linear progress ever could. Civilizations do not end. They transform. Often under pressure, they failed to anticipate. The sky occupies a unique position in this transformation. It is constant enough to feel reliable, yet dynamic enough to deliver surprise. This duality makes it an ideal medium for reminders. When something unexpected appears above, it destabilizes complacency without requiring immediate catastrophe. It opens a window for reflection. In that window, ancient cultures place their most enduring lessons. Pay attention before you are forced to. Record what you do not yet understand. Accept that meaning may arrive late. These lessons are not tied to belief in divine figures or cosmic intent. They are practical responses to living within systems that exceed human control. The Anunnaki, viewed through this lens, are not relics of outdated thinking. They are narrative tools for preserving humility. They remind the listener that oversight exists beyond individual will, whether understood as divine order, natural law, or systemic consequence. Their presence signals that actions unfold within a broader context that cannot be negotiated away. When modern observers reflect on Three-Eye Atlas, the value lies not in connecting it to ancient names, but in recognizing the familiar pattern it activated. Attention sharpened, archives reopened, questions resurfaced. Then the moment passed. What remains is the choice of whether to let that awareness fade or to integrate it into long-term thinking. This chapter does not end with a conclusion. It ends with an invitation to notice how often humanity has stood at similar thresholds, looking up, sensing that stability is provisional. In the next chapter of the Three-Eye Atlas series, we will examine the Great Flood itself, not as a single myth or moment, but as a global pattern that emerges after such thresholds are crossed, again and again, across cultures that never met, yet remembered the same sequence. What they remembered was not the sky alone, but the moment when the sky reminded them that attention, once awakened, is the only inheritance capable of crossing time intact. Attention, once awakened, does not disappear easily, but it can thin with time. This is why ancient narratives often reintroduce catastrophe at the center of the cycle, not as punishment, but as consequence. When warning is noticed yet gradually absorbed back into routine, the system does not reset gently. It resets forcefully. This is where the flood narratives take on their full weight. In the ancient imagination, floods were not anomalies. They were inevitabilities that arrived when thresholds were crossed. Rivers were generous, but only within limits. When those limits failed, water erased distinctions that human order depended on. Borders dissolved, records vanished, hierarchies collapsed. A flood did not argue with the world humans had built. It simply replaced it. This replacement is why floods became the preferred language of reset. Fire destroys selectively. Earthquakes fracture unevenly. Floods cover everything. They create a temporary equality where survival depends less on status than on preparation and chance. For societies deeply structured by rank and ritual, this leveling effect was both terrifying and instructive. Ancient texts rarely linger on the physical details of flooding. Instead, they emphasize what came before and what followed. Before, there is noise, excess, imbalance, neglect. After, there is silence, reflection, and rebuilding. The water itself functions almost like a pause in the narrative, an interval during which the old order is suspended so that a new one can emerge. Celestial warnings fit into this structure as the final signal before suspension. They mark the moment when correction becomes unavoidable. Whether the flood is literal, regional, or symbolic matters less than its role as transition. Something has gone too far. The system can no longer self-correct through minor adjustments. A larger reset becomes necessary. This idea of necessary reset is uncomfortable for modern thinking, which tends to frame disasters as failures rather than phases. Ancient cultures were more ambivalent. They mourned loss deeply, but they also recognized renewal as inseparable from destruction. Crops depend on decay. Cities rise on ruins. Memory itself is selective, allowing some things to die so others can persist. The Anunnaki appear most decisively at this junction. Their deliberations conclude. The period of warning ends. The cycle turns. In narrative terms, they authorize the reset. In practical terms, they represent the moment when accumulated imbalance exceeds tolerance. The story externalizes this threshold to make it comprehensible, but the underlying logic remains systemic. As we move deeper into the catastrophe phase of this chapter, the focus will shift toward how floods were remembered differently across regions and why those differences matter. Not all floods were the same. Not all resets were total. Yet the recurrence of the motif suggests a shared human attempt to understand what happens when adaptation fails and only transformation remains. Transformation, when it arrives through force rather than choice, leaves a distinct imprint on memory. Ancient flood stories carry this imprint not through spectacle, but through restraint. The tone is often subdued, almost procedural, as if the narrators were less interested in dramatizing destruction than in documenting its inevitability. This restraint suggests familiarity. Floods were not imagined horrors. They were lived realities that returned often enough to require explanation without hysteria. In Mesopotamia, flood memory is inseparable from geography. Cities rose on floodplains because fertility demanded proximity to water, even as that proximity guaranteed risk. This tension shaped both engineering and mythology. Levees and canals were built alongside stories of divine warning and judgment. One addressed the physical threat, the other addressed the psychological burden of knowing that protection was never complete. What stands out in these narratives is the repeated insistence that the flood did not come without notice. There is always a period of awareness beforehand. Sometimes it is brief. Sometimes it stretches across generations. The warning may be ignored, misunderstood, or diluted by comfort, but it is rarely absent. This insistence reinforces the idea that catastrophe is not random. It is the visible outcome of invisible accumulation. Across different cultures, the form of the warning changes, but its function remains constant. In some traditions, the warning is a dream. In others, it is a sign in the sky. Elsewhere, it is a shift in the behavior of animals or seasons. These differences reflect local environments, but the underlying narrative role is identical. Something communicates that conditions are no longer stable. Celestial warnings occupy a special position among these signals because they transcend locality. A river flood affects one valley, A strange light in the sky is visible to many. This shared visibility grants the warning broader authority. It cannot be dismissed as rumor or local misfortune. It enters collective awareness, demanding collective interpretation. The Anunnaki, in this phase of the narrative, function as the keepers of collective consequence. Their decisions are not personal, they are systemic. When they withdraw protection or allow the flood, it is framed as a response to imbalance rather than cruelty. This framing preserves moral coherence. The world remains intelligible even in destruction. Modern readers often struggle with this coherence because it appears to justify suffering. Ancient cultures approached it differently. For them, suffering without meaning was the greater threat. A flood that erased everything without explanation would fracture memory itself. By embedding the event within a sequence of warning and deliberation, the culture ensured that even loss could be integrated into understanding. As this chapter continues, the focus will move toward how survivors are portrayed and why their role is essential. Survival is not accidental in these stories. It is conditional. The next movement will explore what qualifies someone to carry memory through a reset, and why that qualification is almost always tied to attention rather than power. Attention, rather than strength or status, is what consistently qualifies survival in ancient flood narratives. This detail is easy to overlook, yet it sits at the moral and psychological core of these stories. Survivors are rarely the most powerful. They are the ones who noticed, who listened, who responded before the threshold was crossed. In this way, survival becomes a form of alignment rather than reward. In Mesopotamian traditions, the preserved individual is often described as ordinary in status, but exceptional in awareness. He is not spared because he commands armies or wealth, but because he is receptive to warning. This receptivity is sometimes framed as obedience to divine instruction, but beneath the language lies a simpler idea. He recognized that the existing order was no longer reliable and acted accordingly. This pattern appears elsewhere with remarkable consistency. Across flood stories worldwide, preservation is linked to foresight, not dominance. A vessel is built, a refuge is prepared, knowledge is gathered. The emphasis is not on heroism, but on preparation. The survivor does not conquer the flood. He endures it by respecting its inevitability. This framing transforms survival into responsibility. Those who pass through the reset carry more than their own lives. They carry memory. They become the bridge between worlds, holding knowledge of what came before and the burden of shaping what comes after. Ancient narratives take this role seriously. Survival is never portrayed as freedom. It is portrayed as obligation. The Anunnaki, or equivalent figures in other traditions, reinforce this obligation by selecting or instructing survivors. This selection is not arbitrary. It reflects the idea that continuity requires caretakers. A world reset without memory would be meaningless repetition. By preserving memory through attentive individuals, the cycle gains direction. This emphasis on memory explains why flood survivors are often tasked with re-establishing order, law, or ritual. They do not simply repopulate the land. They restore structure. They reenact the relationship between humanity and the forces that exceed it. The flood clears the ground, but it does not rewrite the rules. The same conditions that produced imbalance still exist. The difference is awareness. In modern terms, this aspect of the narrative reads less like mythology and more like systems thinking. Complex systems do not fail without warning. They accumulate stress until failure becomes unavoidable. Those who recognize early signals can adapt. Those who do not are overwhelmed. Ancient stories encoded this logic in human terms, ensuring it could be transmitted long before equations existed. As this chapter advances, the question becomes more unsettling. If ancient cultures repeatedly encoded survival as attentiveness, what does that imply about periods when attention fails collectively? The next movement will examine moments in the record where warning is present, yet no preservation follows, and what those absences suggest about forgetting as a form of vulnerability. Forgetting, when it becomes collective, leaves a different kind of silence in the historical record. It is not marked by absence of events, but by absence of continuity. Ancient texts sometimes hint at this silence indirectly through abrupt endings, broken genealogies, or traditions that speak of loss without preservation. These are moments where warning existed, yet no vessel of memory passed through the reset intact. In Mesopotamian sources, there are references to cities that vanished so completely that only their names remained, detached from lineage or ritual continuation. The implication is subtle but powerful. Not every collapse produced survivors capable of carrying memory forward. In these cases, the cycle did not renew smoothly. It fractured. Something essential was lost, and later generations could only gesture toward it with fragments and echoes. This possibility introduces a more sobering dimension to the flood narratives. Attention does not guarantee survival. It increases the probability of continuity, but it does not override all conditions. Some disruptions exceed the adaptive capacity of the societies they strike. Ancient cultures were aware of this, which is why their stories never promise safety. They promise meaning, which is not the same thing. Celestial warnings in this context become even more complex. A sign may appear, be recognized, and still fail to produce preservation. The warning is not invalidated by the outcome. It remains part of the record as evidence that the system was stressed beyond recovery. This reframes warning as diagnostic rather than preventative. It reveals the state of the system, not its fate. The Anunnaki, when they appear in these darker passages, are distant rather than instructive. Their deliberations conclude without mercy or negotiation. This distance reflects a cultural understanding that some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be reversed. The narrative does not moralize this outcome. It accepts it as part of the structure of cycles themselves. What survives in these moments is not lineage, but pattern. Later cultures remember that something ended, even if they no longer remember what it was. They inherit caution without context. This may explain why flood motifs persist, even where specific details are inconsistent or contradictory. The emotional truth outlives the informational one. From a modern perspective, this aspect of ancient memory feels uncomfortable because it resists optimism. It suggests that awareness has limits and that some forms of collapse are not negotiated away. Yet it also reinforces the value of attention. Even when preservation fails, the act of noticing still leaves a trace. It shapes future expectation, even if it cannot save the present. As the catastrophe phase of this chapter continues, the narrative will turn toward scale. Not every flood was global. Not every reset erased everything. Understanding how ancient cultures differentiated between regional devastation and total renewal will help clarify why some warnings resulted in continuity, while others dissolved into silence, remembered only as shadows beneath the surface of later myths. Scale is the element that ancient narratives handle with the most care. Flood stories often feel absolute when read quickly, yet closer attention reveals that they are rarely precise about extent. The language expands and contracts, sometimes suggesting total destruction, other times implying devastation limited to a known world rather than the entire planet. This ambiguity is not accidental. It reflects how ancient societies understood catastrophe through lived boundaries rather than global abstraction. For a river civilization, the world was defined by floodplains, trade routes, and seasonal reach. When water erased those reference points, it felt total, even if distant regions remained untouched. Memory followed perception. The flood became everything because everything familiar was gone. Later retellings preserved this emotional scale, not geographic accuracy, because emotion was what needed to survive. This helps explain why flood narratives from different regions can feel simultaneously universal and incompatible. Each culture remembered the end of its own world. Each encoded that ending as a reset of reality itself. The shared structure does not require a single global event. It requires repeated experiences of overwhelming loss that exceeded local capacity to recover without fundamental change. Celestial warnings functioned as markers of escalation across these varying scales. A minor disruption might follow a local sign. A larger sign implied broader consequence. Ancient observers did not measure magnitude numerically. They inferred it relationally. How strange was the sign? How widespread was its visibility? How intense was the unease it produced? Scale was felt before it was understood. The Anunnaki, when invoked in relation to scale, appear less as decision-makers and more as arbiters of scope. Their judgments determine how far correction extends. A city may fall, a region may flood, or an age may end. This narrative device allowed cultures to process different levels of catastrophe within a single coherent framework, rather than inventing a new explanation for each disaster. Modern readers sometimes interpret this as exaggeration, but it is more accurately compression. Ancient memory condensed multiple events across centuries into archetypal moments. Several floods become one flood. Several warnings become one warning. This condensation was not meant to deceive. It was meant to preserve intelligibility. Too many details fracture memory. Structure holds it together. When viewed through this lens, the persistence of flood myths across continents becomes less mysterious. Humanity did not need to experience one shared cataclysm to produce shared narratives. It needed to repeatedly encounter limits, repeatedly notice signs before collapse, and repeatedly rebuild in altered conditions. The sky, ever present and occasionally disruptive, provided a unifying reference point for these experiences. As this chapter moves forward, the focus will shift again, this time toward chronology. Ancient texts often resist linear timelines, blending past events with future expectation. Understanding how time itself was perceived will clarify why warnings, floods, and renewals are remembered as cycles rather than sequences, and why the past often feels closer in these narratives than the present does to us today. Time, in ancient memory, does not move the way modern calendars suggest it should. It folds, it circles back on itself, it stretches and compresses according to meaning rather than measurement. This perception of time is essential for understanding why warnings and floods are remembered as cycles instead of isolated historical moments. The past is not behind. It is beneath, layered and accessible whenever conditions resemble those that once triggered collapse. In Mesopotamian texts, chronology often dissolves into recurrence. Kingship descends from heaven, is lost, and then descends again. Cities rise, fall, and are rebuilt on the same ground. Floods interrupt the flow, but they do not terminate it. This structure reflects a lived reality where ruins were not abandoned entirely. They were reused. Memory was spatial as much as temporal. To walk through a city was to walk through multiple eras at once. Celestial warnings fit naturally into this layered sense of time. A sign in the sky was not merely new. It was familiar in its unfamiliarity. It echoed earlier moments when the sky had behaved strangely and change had followed. When scribes recorded these signs, they were not always concerned with dating them precisely. They were concerned with positioning them within a known cycle. This has happened before. It will happen again. The Anunnaki occupy a timeless role within this framework. They are not bound to a single era. They appear whenever thresholds are crossed, regardless of historical context. This makes them less like characters and more like functions. They represent the recurring moment when accumulation forces decision. Their presence signals that the cycle has reached a critical point. From a modern perspective, this can feel frustratingly imprecise. We want timelines that move forward, events that happen once, and explanations that retire questions permanently. Ancient cultures were less invested in closure. For them, the value of memory was not in settling accounts with the past, but in preparing for its return in altered form. This approach to time also explains why ancient narratives often blur cause and consequence. A warning may appear after the conditions that made catastrophe inevitable are already in place. In linear thinking, this feels backwards. In cyclical thinking, it makes sense. The sign does not cause the collapse. It reveals that collapse is already underway. Modern science, in its own way, has begun to rediscover this logic. Climate systems, ecological feedback loops, and long-term risk models all emphasize accumulation over moments. There is rarely a single point of failure. There is a slow drift toward instability, punctuated by events that make the drift visible. Ancient cultures encoded this understanding narratively, long before it could be expressed mathematically. When an object like 3i Atlas appears in the modern sky, it briefly pulls contemporary awareness into this older mode of time. For a moment, the present feels connected to a deeper past. Questions arise that do not belong to the news cycle. They belong to inheritance. Have we seen this pattern before? How did others respond? What was remembered and what was lost? As this chapter continues toward its final acts, the remaining exploration will focus on inheritance itself. Not genetic inheritance, but cultural memory carried through cycles of loss and renewal. The sky may change, the ground may flood, cities may vanish, yet something continues to pass forward, quietly shaping how each new generation looks up and decides whether what it sees is ordinary or a reminder that the cycle is turning once again. Inheritance, when it survives catastrophe, rarely travels intact. It moves in fragments carried by stories, symbols, and habits that outlast the structures that produced them. Ancient cultures understood this fragmentation intuitively. They did not expect memory to remain complete. They expected it to endure in pieces, reassembled each time conditions demanded reflection. This is why so much ancient knowledge appears indirect. Instead of explicit instructions, we find echoes. Instead of explanations, we find patterns. A warning here, a flood there, a renewal implied, but not detailed. These fragments were not failures of preservation. They were adaptations to the reality that no system, cultural or material, survives every reset without loss. Celestial warnings occupy a privileged place within this fragmented inheritance because they are less vulnerable to erosion. The sky does not decay, its patterns repeat. Even when names and meanings change, the act of looking up remains constant. This continuity allows later generations to recognize fragments of ancient concern without knowing their origin. A strange object appears. Unease follows. Stories surface, even if their sources are no longer remembered. The Anunnaki, in this sense, function as mnemonic anchors. Their forms shift, their stories evolve, but their role persists. They mark the junction between observation and consequence. They remind listeners that what is seen above may matter below, even if the connection is unclear. This reminder survives because it is simple, adaptable, and emotionally resonant. Across cultures, inheritance often takes the form of cautionary posture rather than specific knowledge. Be attentive. Expect change. Do not assume stability is permanent. These lessons require no technical understanding to remain relevant. They can be passed to children, embedded in ritual, or woven into myth. They endure precisely because they are not detailed. Modern societies often undervalue this kind of inheritance. We prioritize data over disposition, information over posture. Yet when systems fail, it is posture that determines response. The ability to recognize warning, to slow down, to reassess assumptions matters more in moments of instability than precise recall of past events. The appearance of 3i Atlas briefly activated this ancient inheritance. Questions surfaced that were not strictly scientific. They were historical and existential. How often are we surprised? How prepared are we to notice what does not fit expectation? These questions did not arise from superstition. They arose from a deep, inherited understanding that surprise has consequences. Ancient narratives preserved this understanding by refusing to separate sky and society completely. They treated them as interacting domains within a single system. When one shifted, the other eventually followed. This holistic view does not conflict with modern science. It complements it by addressing the human dimension of uncertainty that equations alone cannot manage. As we approach the final phase of this chapter, the emphasis will move toward reflection rather than accumulation. The goal is no longer to compare texts or trace patterns, but to consider what remains after such comparisons. What does it mean to live with inherited warnings that cannot be fully explained, yet refuse to disappear? The closing movement will return to stillness, to the quiet act of looking up, and to the recognition that some questions persist, not because they are unanswered, but because they are meant to accompany humanity through every cycle, waiting patiently for the moment when attention is once again awakened. The moment when attention is awakened rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It arrives as a subtle shift, a quiet awareness that something familiar has become slightly unfamiliar. Ancient cultures did not treat this moment as revelation. They treated it as responsibility. Once attention sharpened, it had to be maintained, carried forward, protected from erosion by routine and forgetfulness. This is why the closing phases of flood narratives often emphasize restraint rather than triumph. After survival, there is no celebration of conquest over chaos. There is rebuilding, measurement, boundary setting, and remembrance. Survivors mark the land, re-establish calendars, and renew agreements with forces they know they do not command. The reset does not erase humility, it deepens it. In these moments, the sky recedes into the background again, not because it has lost significance, but because its message has been integrated. The warning has done its work. Attention has been recalibrated. Life resumes, but with altered expectations. Ancient texts suggest that this recalibration was never meant to last forever. Over generations, comfort would return, vigilance would soften, and the cycle would begin again. The Anunnaki are largely absent from these quieter passages, and that absence is meaningful. Their role is not to oversee stability, but to mark transition. Once balance is temporarily restored, they withdraw. The narrative focus shifts back to human responsibility. How the world unfolds from that point depends not on divine intervention, but on whether attention is sustained. This withdrawal underscores one of the most understated lessons in ancient memory. Warnings do not replace agency. They activate it. The sky does not decide the future. It signals when decision becomes unavoidable. What follows is shaped by preparation, adaptability, and restraint, qualities that must be practiced long before disruption arrives. When modern observers reflect on objects like 3i Atlas, the relevance of this lesson becomes clear. The object did not demand action. It demanded consideration. It reopened questions about monitoring, preparedness, and humility in the face of scale. The fact that no catastrophe followed does not diminish its value. It reinforces the idea that warning and consequence are not always synchronized. Ancient cultures accepted this lack of synchronization without frustration. They were comfortable holding awareness without outcome. Modern culture struggles with this patience. We expect immediacy. We seek resolution. Yet the deepest lessons of ancient narratives unfold slowly across generations, not moments. As this chapter nears its closing act, the story turns inward once more. The focus shifts from what ancient cultures recorded to why those records continue to resonate. The persistence of these narratives suggests that humanity has never fully resolved its relationship with uncertainty. The sky remains a reminder, distant yet intimate, that attention is not a state achieved once, but a practice renewed whenever the familiar order shows its cracks. The final movement will not attempt to answer whether ancient civilizations recorded specific celestial objects. It will reflect on why the question continues to matter and why, even now, a quiet glance upward can still awaken memories older than language, inviting us to listen carefully to what has been passed down, not as knowledge, but as posture, waiting patiently for the next turning of the cycle. The question continuing to matter is itself part of the inheritance. Ancient narratives rarely ask questions to receive answers. They ask them to sustain orientation. A question kept alive does work over time. It shapes behavior, tempers certainty and slows decisions that would otherwise rush forward unchecked. In this sense, wondering whether ancient civilizations recorded celestial warnings is less about verification and more about continuity of attention. When we examine these traditions carefully, we find that they are not obsessed with the sky in isolation. The sky is meaningful because it interrupts. It breaks the illusion that the present arrangement of things is permanent or sufficient. Ancient cultures did not require constant reminders of this truth. They needed only occasional disruptions, carefully remembered and retold, to recalibrate expectation. This recalibration is subtle. It does not produce fear. It produces humility. To live beneath a sky capable of surprise is to accept that planning has limits. Ancient societies built laws, calendars, and cities knowing that none of them were final. This acceptance allowed flexibility. When disruption arrived, it was devastating, but not incomprehensible. It belonged to a larger rhythm that had been acknowledged long before it was felt. The Anunnaki, in this interpretive phase, become almost abstract. They are no longer actors within the story, but symbols of scale. They represent forces that exceed individual intention, whether understood as divine will, natural law, or systemic consequence. Their persistence across retellings reflects a refusal to collapse complexity into simple cause and effect. Modern thinking often seeks to dissolve such symbols, to translate them entirely into mechanism. Yet something is lost when that translation is forced too quickly. Mechanism explains how, but it does not always address how humans live with uncertainty while explanation remains incomplete. Ancient narratives bridge that gap by preserving posture alongside memory. In the context of Three-Eye Atlas, this bridging function becomes visible. The object did not change daily life. It changed awareness briefly. It reminded observers that detection does not equal control and that knowledge expands unevenly. These realizations echo ancient lessons without requiring ancient belief systems to be adopted. As the narrative moves toward its final reflections, the emphasis rests on this continuity of posture. Across thousands of years, humans have looked up, noticed deviation, and asked what it might mean. The language has changed. The tools have evolved. The impulse remains. The sky does not need to speak often to remain influential. Its silence, punctuated by rare surprises, is enough. Each appearance that defies expectation becomes a mirror, reflecting not destiny, but readiness. Ancient cultures understood this intuitively. They did not seek certainty from the sky. They sought orientation within change. The remaining blocks will bring this chapter to a close by returning to stillness. Not silence as absence, but silence as space. A space where memory settles, questions remain open, and attention is allowed to rest without forgetting. In that space, the ancient and the modern meet quietly, not to agree on explanations, but to share the same posture beneath a sky that has never promised answers, only reminders that the cycle continues, patiently, whether we are watching or not. Stillness is where ancient narratives often end, not because nothing remains to be said, but because stillness is where attention matures. After warnings are noted, floods remembered, and renewals traced, the story settles into a quieter register. This quiet is deliberate. It mirrors the state a society must reach if it hopes to live with uncertainty without being consumed by it. Ancient cultures did not mistake stillness for safety. They understood it as an interval, a pause between movements of the cycle. In these intervals, the sky returns to familiarity. Seasons resume their rhythms. Memory softens at the edges. It is here, not during catastrophe, that the real test appears. Can awareness be sustained when nothing demands it? Texts from Mesopotamia and beyond hint that this was the most difficult phase. After rebuilding, after order was restored, attention naturally drifted back toward the immediate and the practical. Crops had to be planted. Trade resumed. Authority reasserted itself. The sky remained above, unchanged enough to invite forgetting. This is why stories of warning had to be told again, even when they felt distant or irrelevant. The Anunnaki are rarely invoked during these periods of calm. Their absence is not oversight. It signals that the burden of continuity has shifted fully onto human systems. The gods withdraw, the councils fall silent, and the world is handed back to routine. What happens next depends on whether memory has been integrated deeply enough to shape behavior without constant reminder. This dynamic reveals something important about ancient wisdom. It was not oriented toward prediction. It was oriented toward endurance. The goal was not to know exactly when disruption would return, but to remain capable of recognizing it when it did. That capability required habits, stories, and shared expectations that could survive boredom as well as fear. In modern contexts, boredom is often where awareness collapses. Information overload dulls sensitivity. Rare events are quickly absorbed into data streams and forgotten. Ancient societies faced a different challenge, but the underlying risk was the same. Familiarity breeds neglect. The sky must surprise again to be noticed. When Three-Eye Atlas appeared, it briefly interrupted modern stillness. It did not demand action, but it invited reconsideration. For a moment, attention expanded beyond routine. That moment passed, as moments always do. What remains is the quieter question of whether anything lasting was integrated or whether the interruption will fade without residue. Ancient narratives suggest that residue matters more than reaction. A warning that leaves no trace might as well not have occurred. A warning that subtly reshapes expectation, even without immediate consequence, becomes part of long memory. It influences how future signs are interpreted, how quickly attention sharpens, how seriously uncertainty is taken. As this chapter approaches its closing act, the emphasis will be on this residue of attention, not the events themselves, but what they leave behind in the collective posture of a civilization. The sky does not require belief to influence behavior. It requires only that its rare deviations be remembered long enough to alter how the familiar is perceived. In the final blocks, the narrative will slow further. The aim will not be to add new material, but to allow what has already been said to settle. Like ancient listeners gathered in quiet spaces, the modern audience is invited not to conclude, but to carry forward a softened awareness, one that does not seek answers from the sky, but remains open to the possibility that some of the most important warnings arrive without urgency, asking only that they not be forgotten. Softened awareness is difficult to describe because it does not announce itself through action. It expresses itself through restraint, through pauses taken where haste would have been easier. Ancient cultures valued this state deeply, even if they struggled to maintain it. Their stories returned to it repeatedly, suggesting that awareness without urgency was the most fragile and most precious achievement of all. In the wake of remembered floods and recorded warnings, societies often attempted to institutionalize this softened awareness. Calendars were refined, observatories were maintained. Priestly or scholarly classes were tasked with watching patterns others had neither time nor inclination to notice. These structures were not created out of fascination with the sky, but out of an understanding that vigilance cannot depend solely on individual curiosity. It must be embedded into culture if it is to survive periods of calm. Yet even these institutions were vulnerable. Over time, observation could become routine rather than reflective. Records could be copied without being questioned. Signs could be categorized without being felt. Ancient texts quietly acknowledge this erosion. They speak of watchers who failed to see, of councils that delayed too long, of warnings that were technically recorded but emotionally ignored. These moments are not framed as moral failures. They are framed as human ones. The Anunnaki, when they reappear after long silence, often do so abruptly. Their return marks the end of complacency. It suggests that systems of attention had become hollow, preserving form without substance. The warning, when it comes, feels sudden not because it was unanticipated, but because anticipation had dulled. The narrative reminds the listener that vigilance is not preserved by procedure alone. It requires presence. This insight carries forward with remarkable relevance. Modern societies have unprecedented monitoring capabilities. Data flows continuously, alerts are automated, and yet awareness can still thin. Signals compete for attention. Importance becomes relative. The danger is not lack of information, but saturation. Ancient cultures faced scarcity. Modern cultures face excess. Both conditions threaten sustained attention. When an object like 3-Eye Atlas enters awareness, it momentarily cuts through saturation. Its rarity grants it weight. For a brief interval, attention converges. Questions slow down. Context is sought. This convergence resembles ancient moments of collective noticing, when a sign in the sky temporarily overrode local concerns and demanded shared interpretation. What matters most is not how long that convergence lasts, but what it deposits. Does it leave behind a subtle recalibration of expectation, or does attention snap back unchanged? Ancient narratives were designed to maximize deposit. By retelling warnings long after their immediate relevance faded, they ensured that each retelling refreshed the residue of awareness. This process required patience. Stories were not consumed quickly. They were repeated, memorized, and revisited, meaning accumulated gradually, layered across lifetimes. Modern storytelling rarely allows for this tempo. Content is replaced rapidly. Reflection is optional. The result is a culture highly informed but often poorly oriented. As this chapter moves closer to its conclusion, the comparison sharpens. Ancient cultures lacked precision, but cultivated endurance. Modern cultures possess precision, but struggle with continuity. The sky, unchanged in its distance, continues to serve as a common reference point. It offers neither reassurance nor threat by default. It offers perspective. In the remaining blocks, the narrative will step back even further, examining why perspective itself may be the most enduring gift ancient sky watchers attempted to pass forward. Not knowledge of specific events, not predictions of future catastrophe, but a trained sense of scale, a reminder that human systems exist within larger rhythms, and that awareness, once learned, must be practiced quietly if it is to survive the long stretches when nothing appears to demand it. Perspective, once gained, alters the way silence is experienced. It transforms absence into interval, stillness into potential. Ancient cultures treated this transformation with care, understanding that silence was not emptiness, but a condition that required cultivation. Without perspective, silence invites forgetting. With perspective, it becomes a space where memory can breathe. This understanding is reflected in how ancient observers described long periods without signs. These stretches were not framed as reassurance that danger had passed. They were framed as preparation time. Fields were restored, laws were refined, stories were retold. The absence of disruption was not interpreted as permission to relax attention, but as an opportunity to strengthen the structures that would one day be tested again. Celestial observation continued, even when nothing unusual appeared. This persistence mattered. By watching the ordinary sky, ancient observers trained themselves to notice deviation. Familiarity did not breed indifference, because familiarity itself was studied. The regular motions of stars and seasons became a baseline against which irregularity could be measured. Without that baseline, a warning would arrive unnoticed, lost in the noise of untrained perception. The Anunnaki, in these long, quiet phases, exist only as memory. They are not active agents. They are reminders of what happens when attention collapses entirely. Their stories are not warnings shouted into stillness, but whispers carried forward to prevent stillness from becoming oblivion. In this way, they function less like gods and more like mnemonic devices. ensuring that perspective does not erode completely between cycles. Modern societies rarely treat stillness this way. Periods without crisis are often treated as proof of progress rather than intervals of preparation. Attention migrates toward productivity, efficiency, and growth, while vigilance is deprioritized because it appears unprofitable. Ancient cultures, living closer to collapse, could not afford this illusion. They understood that preparation undertaken in calm determined survival during disruption. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas briefly punctured modern stillness. It was not a crisis, but it was a reminder that the sky remains capable of deviation. For a moment, perspective widened. Time stretched backward as ancient questions resurfaced, and forward as modern systems evaluated their readiness. That moment passed quietly, leaving behind a choice that rarely announces itself: integrate the perspective or let it dissolve. Ancient narratives were designed to resist dissolution. They tied perspective to identity. To belong to a culture was to inherit its remembered warnings and its practiced stillness. Perspective was not an individual insight. It was a communal posture reinforced through repetition. This made it resilient. Even when knowledge degraded, orientation remained. The loss of this communal perspective is one of the most subtle vulnerabilities of modern life. Individuals may understand risk, but shared orientation is harder to sustain. Attention fragments, memory disperses, the sky remains above, but its capacity to unify perception weakens as fewer people look up with the same questions in mind. Yet the impulse has not vanished. It reappears whenever an unexpected object interrupts routine. It surfaces in the unease that follows recognition of scale. It lingers in the quiet after attention fades, asking whether something should have been held longer. These moments echo ancient stillness, offering an opportunity to recover perspective before it slips away again. As this chapter approaches its final movement, the narrative will not resolve these tensions. Resolution would contradict the lesson. Instead, it will settle into acknowledgement. Perspective is fragile. Awareness requires maintenance. Warnings do not arrive on schedule. The sky does not care whether we are ready. What ancient cultures attempted to pass forward was not certainty, but readiness of mind, a way of inhabiting silence without mistaking it for safety, and of receiving interruption without collapsing into fear. The closing blocks will return fully to this posture. They will not ask the listener to believe anything about ancient gods or celestial intent. They will ask only that the long memory of attention be allowed to resurface, gently, as it has so many times before, whenever the familiar sky briefly reveals that it has never truly been under human control. Readiness of mind is not a dramatic state. It does not feel like anticipation or alertness in the modern sense. Ancient cultures understood readiness as something quieter, almost indistinguishable from calm. It was a condition cultivated over time, reinforced by repetition, and tested only occasionally. Most of life passed without incident, yet readiness remained present, woven into how the world was perceived. This is why ancient narratives rarely climax with catastrophe itself. The flood, the collapse, the disruption often occupies less space than what surrounds it. What matters more is the preparation before and the adjustment after. Catastrophe is transient. Readiness is continuous. The stories persist because they train the listener to value the continuous over the spectacular. In many traditions, this readiness is described indirectly through restraint. Characters who survive are not impulsive. They do not rush to interpret signs or force meaning from them. They observe, they wait, they consult memory rather than emotion. This patience is not indecision. It is an understanding that premature certainty can be as dangerous as neglect. Celestial warnings, when they appear, test this patience. A strange object in the sky invites immediate explanation. Ancient cultures resisted that impulse. They allowed signs to remain ambiguous. They watched how the world responded before assigning meaning. This delay was not ignorance, it was discipline. Meaning, they understood, often emerges through sequence rather than instant clarity. The Anunnaki narratives reflect this discipline through deliberation scenes that feel almost slow to modern readers. Decisions are postponed, councils gather, outcomes are weighed. These passages are not filler, they encode an ethic of hesitation. When systems approach threshold, haste accelerates collapse. Delay, paradoxically, can preserve. Modern culture struggles with this ethic. Speed is equated with competence. Immediate interpretation is rewarded. Ambiguity is treated as weakness. Yet when complexity is high, speed amplifies error. Ancient narratives offer a counterbalance. They suggest that when signs appear without explanation, the correct response is not urgency but sustained attention. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas briefly placed modern observers in this ancient posture. For a moment, interpretation slowed. Caution replaced assumption. Multiple possibilities were held without resolution. This moment did not feel satisfying. It felt incomplete. That discomfort reveals how unfamiliar readiness has become. We prefer answers to orientation, even when answers are provisional. Ancient cultures accepted incompletion as part of awareness. A warning did not demand closure, it demanded continuity of attention. The task was not to solve the sky, but to remain capable of noticing it again. This capability was cultivated through memory, ritual, and shared silence as much as through observation. As this chapter continues toward its final blocks, the narrative narrows further. The focus is no longer on ancient texts or modern objects, but on the internal landscape shaped by repeated exposure to uncertainty. What kind of mind emerges when generations are taught not to expect permanence? What kind of society forms when readiness is valued more than reassurance? The remaining movement will reflect on this internal inheritance, not as philosophy, not as doctrine, but as atmosphere, a tone carried forward through time, barely articulated, yet deeply felt. It is the tone of a culture that knows the sky can change without warning, and that the most reliable response is not prediction or fear, but a practiced calm that allows attention to endure long enough for meaning to reveal itself, slowly, when it is ready to do so. A practiced calm does not eliminate uncertainty. It makes room for it. Ancient cultures treated uncertainty as a condition of existence rather than a problem to be solved. Their narratives did not promise clarity, they promised continuity. This distinction is subtle, yet it reshapes everything. When clarity is the goal, unanswered questions feel like failure. When continuity is the goal, unanswered questions become companions. This companionship with uncertainty is why ancient stories often feel unfinished to modern readers. They trail off. They return to beginnings. They circle familiar themes without resolution. This is not lack of narrative skill. It is an intentional reflection of lived experience. The sky does not conclude. It repeats, shifts, and surprises, then returns to apparent normalcy. Human understanding follows the same rhythm. Celestial warnings occupy a precise place within this rhythm. They are interruptions that test whether calm has become complacency. A sign in the sky does not demand panic. It demands recalibration. Ancient observers were less interested in the sign itself than in how society responded to it. Did leaders listen? Did records expand? Did rituals deepen? Or did the moment pass without integration? The Anunnaki narratives repeatedly emphasize this response over the event. The deliberations matter more than the decision. The pause matters more than the outcome. This focus reveals a cultural priority that modern thinking often overlooks. How a society processes uncertainty determines its resilience more than the uncertainty itself. In periods when attention was sustained, ancient texts suggest that disruption could be absorbed with less damage. Adjustments occurred incrementally. Memory was refreshed. Renewal followed without total collapse. In periods when attention had thinned, the same magnitude of disruption produced far greater loss. The narratives do not claim causation. They imply correlation. Awareness alters trajectory. Modern systems operate under similar principles, even if the language has changed. Early signals allow gradual adaptation. Late recognition forces abrupt correction. The difference is not the presence of warning, but the readiness to receive it. Ancient stories encoded this lesson narratively, because narrative travels further than data alone. When 3i Atlas entered awareness, it functioned as a test of modern readiness, not a test of technology, but of posture. Could uncertainty be held without immediate resolution? Could attention persist beyond the news cycle? Could the moment be integrated quietly, without exaggeration or dismissal? The ancient record suggests that most societies struggled with this. Readiness was always fragile. It had to be renewed constantly, or it decayed into habit. This is why warning narratives were never allowed to fade completely. They were retold even when they seemed irrelevant, precisely because irrelevance was the danger. As this chapter approaches its closing reflections, the emphasis shifts from analysis to acknowledgement. Humanity has always lived beneath a sky capable of surprise. The tools for noticing have changed. The need for readiness has not. Ancient cultures attempted to pass this readiness forward through story, symbol, and silence. The final blocks will not add new arguments. They will slow the narrative to its quietest register. Like ancient listeners gathered after long recitations, the modern listener is invited to rest within the awareness that has been built gradually. Not to decide what the sky means, but to accept that meaning unfolds over time, and that attention, once practiced, is the most enduring inheritance any civilization can leave behind. Attention, when practiced over generations, becomes something like an atmosphere rather than a skill. It shapes how questions are asked, how silence is interpreted, and how surprise is absorbed without shock. Ancient cultures rarely named this atmosphere directly. They lived inside it. Their stories functioned less as instruction manuals and more as climate, conditioning perception slowly, almost invisibly. This is why the most enduring ancient narratives feel calm even when they describe catastrophe. They are not detached. They are seasoned. The voice that speaks of floods and collapse has already accepted that such events belong to the rhythm of existence. What matters is not preventing every disruption, but preserving coherence through it. Attention is the thread that holds coherence together when structures fail. Celestial warnings play a crucial role in maintaining this coherence because they arrive from outside human systems. They cannot be negotiated with or reinterpreted away easily. A strange object in the sky, a deviation in motion, an unexpected light, these bypass politics, ideology, and social hierarchy. Everyone looks up at the same thing. For a moment, perception aligns. Ancient cultures recognized the rarity of such alignment. They treated it carefully. The moment was not exploited for spectacle. It was integrated into memory. Councils formed. Records expanded. Stories were adjusted to include the new deviation without discarding the old structure. The sky did not rewrite the narrative. It modified it. The Anunnaki, in their most abstract function, represent this modification process. They are not creators of meaning, but custodians of transition. They appear when the existing framework must be widened to accommodate something new. Once that accommodation occurs, they recede. Their presence marks change, not control. Modern societies experience similar moments of perceptual alignment, but they pass quickly. Information spreads rapidly, then fragments just as fast. Shared attention dissolves before it can reshape deeper structures. Ancient narratives compensated for this fragility by slowing time through repetition. A story told across centuries does not fade easily. It reshapes expectation long after its original context is forgotten. When 3i Atlas appeared, it offered a brief opportunity for such reshaping. It reminded observers that not everything follows established patterns, and that detection does not eliminate uncertainty. The question is not whether ancient civilizations recorded this object or others like it. The question is whether modern societies still possess the cultural mechanisms required to let such moments alter posture rather than merely inform. Ancient memory suggests that posture matters more than precision. A society oriented toward attentiveness can adapt even with incomplete knowledge. A society oriented toward certainty struggles when certainty dissolves. This lesson does not belong to the past. It repeats quietly in every era that believes itself exceptional. As this chapter approaches its final stretch, the narrative releases its analytical grip. The comparisons, the patterns, the interpretations begin to loosen. What remains is a tone carried forward deliberately, a tone of calm vigilance, of acceptance without resignation, of curiosity without urgency. The sky has always been capable of interruption. That fact has never changed. What has changed, again and again, is how long the interruption is allowed to echo. Ancient cultures extended the echo through story. Modern cultures shorten it through speed. Neither approach is inevitable. They are choices, renewed each time attention is offered or withdrawn. The closing movement will not argue for return or reform. It will simply rest in the recognition that attention itself is cyclical. It awakens, fades, and awakens again. The sky does not demand to be watched constantly. It only requires that when it does change, someone remembers how to look, not with fear or certainty, but with the practiced calm that allows meaning to unfold at its own pace, across time that is deeper than any single moment. Across long spans of time, the practiced calm described in ancient narratives becomes almost invisible, precisely because it does not call attention to itself. It is sensed only when it is absent. Civilizations that lose it often realize the loss too late, when surprise turns into shock and shock into fragmentation. Ancient stories linger on this threshold, not to frighten, but to remind listeners how fragile orientation can be once it slips. What these narratives quietly insist upon is that attention is not merely an intellectual act. It is a cultural condition. It must be shared to endure. A single observer can notice a sign, but without collective memory that notice dissolves. This is why ancient societies embedded sky watching into ritual, calendar, and identity. The sky was not watched for curiosity alone. It was watched so that attention itself would become communal. Celestial warnings gained their power not from rarity alone, but from the way they synchronized perception. A deviation seen by many at once created a pause in ordinary life. That pause allowed memory to surface. Stories were recalled. Previous cycles were remembered. Even those who did not understand the sign felt the shift in atmosphere. This collective pause is difficult to achieve in modern life, where attention is rarely synchronized for long. The Anunnaki narratives preserve the memory of such pauses. Their councils are not dramatic scenes of divine command. They are metaphors for collective reflection. When the gods deliberate, humanity is being invited to do the same. The stories externalize the pause so that it can be remembered even when societies forget how to create it on their own. Modern science, despite its precision, often struggles to generate this kind of pause. Data arrives continuously, leaving little room for reflection. An anomaly is processed quickly and absorbed into models, sometimes before its cultural significance can be felt. Ancient narratives moved more slowly by necessity, but that slowness carried a hidden advantage. It allowed meaning to mature. The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas briefly recreated an ancient pause. Not a dramatic one, but a noticeable one. Conversations slowed, context widened, history resurfaced. The question of whether ancient civilizations recorded similar signs emerged not because evidence demanded it, but because memory stirred. The mind reached backward instinctively, searching for continuity. This instinct is older than writing. It reflects a deep human need to place the present within a longer arc. Ancient cultures satisfied this need through myth and ritual. Modern cultures attempt to satisfy it through data and prediction. Both approaches aim at the same outcome: Orientation within uncertainty. As this chapter nears its conclusion, it becomes clear that the most important inheritance from ancient sky watchers is not information about specific events. It is permission to pause, permission to hold uncertainty without rushing to resolve it, permission to let attention widen beyond immediate utility. The flood stories, the warnings, the renewals, all converge on this lesson. Disruption is inevitable. Collapse is possible. Renewal requires memory, and memory requires attention that is practiced even when nothing seems to demand it. In the final blocks, the narrative will settle fully into this understanding. The movement will slow. The comparisons will fall away. What remains is the quiet recognition that humanity has always lived under a sky that occasionally interrupts certainty, and that the most reliable response has never been prediction or denial, but a calm willingness to notice, to remember, and to carry forward a posture that allows each generation to meet the unknown with steadiness rather than fear. Steadiness, in ancient terms, was never confused with control. The sky could not be commanded, negotiated with, or predicted in any final way. What could be cultivated was the capacity to remain oriented when that sky behaved unexpectedly. This orientation did not belong to individuals alone. It belonged to cultures that learned how to sustain attention beyond moments of crisis. In the closing phases of ancient narratives, there is often a return to ordinary life that feels deliberately understated. Fields are replanted, boundaries are marked again, calendars resume, the world continues, altered but recognizable. This ordinariness is not anticlimax, it is affirmation. Survival is meaningful only if life can be lived again without constant fear. Celestial warnings, once integrated, fade back into the background of memory. They are not meant to dominate consciousness indefinitely. They are meant to leave a residue, a subtle recalibration of expectation that influences how future deviations are perceived. Ancient cultures trusted this residue more than constant vigilance. They knew attention could not be sustained at high intensity forever. The Anunnaki in these final movements exist almost entirely as memory. Their active role has ended. What remains is the imprint of their presence, a reminder that thresholds exist and that crossing them has consequences. The gods withdraw not because they are irrelevant, but because their work is complete. Attention has been awakened and must now be maintained without external prompt. This withdrawal carries a profound implication. Responsibility ultimately rests with humanity. Warnings do not absolve societies of agency. They expose it. What happens after a sign appears depends not on the sky, but on how deeply memory has been integrated into daily life. Modern parallels are unavoidable. Technology can detect anomalies earlier than ever before, yet detection alone does not create resilience. Resilience emerges from culture, from shared understanding of limits, from willingness to adapt before force demands it. Ancient narratives grasped this intuitively, encoding it into stories that outlived the societies that first told them. As this chapter enters its final act, the emphasis shifts fully to release. Not release from responsibility, but release from the need to conclude. Ancient stories rarely end with certainty. They end with continuation. The cycle does not close, it turns. The sky remains above, unchanged in its distance, yet endlessly capable of interruption. Whether those interruptions become warnings, curiosities, or forgotten moments depends on the posture carried forward by those who look up. The final movement invites the listener not to decide what ancient civilizations knew, but to consider what they practiced, and whether that practice still has a place in a world that often mistakes speed for understanding. Understanding, in the ancient sense, was never about collecting answers until uncertainty disappeared. It was about learning how to live inside uncertainty without losing orientation. This distinction is critical because it reveals why ancient narratives feel so different from modern explanations. They do not seek closure, they seek balance. Flood stories, celestial warnings, divine deliberations, all of these elements function as tools for alignment rather than information. They orient the listener within a world that is larger, older, and more complex than any single generation can master. To understand was not to explain away the unknown, but to recognize its presence and adjust behavior accordingly. This is why ancient texts often resist precise interpretation. They are not puzzles designed to be solved. They are environments designed to be entered. Each retelling places the listener back into the posture of attentiveness, reminding them that knowledge is provisional and that stability is temporary. The value lies not in what is learned once, but in what is remembered repeatedly. The Anunnaki, when viewed through this lens, lose any need for literal interpretation. They become narrative expressions of scale, memory, and threshold. They appear when accumulated conditions demand reconsideration, and they withdraw once awareness has been restored. Their purpose is not intervention, but orientation. In modern discussions, there is often an urgency to decide what ancient civilizations knew, what they predicted, and whether they were correct. Ancient narratives themselves show little interest in such judgments. Their concern is endurance. How does a culture survive long enough to ask the same questions again, even after loss, even after collapse? The appearance of Three-Eye Atlas briefly reopened this ancient mode of understanding. It reminded observers that not all significance arrives with consequence, and that not all warnings culminate in visible disruption. Sometimes meaning lies in the reminder itself, in the momentary widening of awareness before routine closes back in. As this chapter prepares to release its grip, it becomes clear that the most enduring legacy of ancient skywatchers is not encoded in tablets or myths alone. It is encoded in posture, a way of standing within time, a willingness to accept that explanation is not always immediate, and that patience itself is a form of knowledge. Memory, when carried across generations, does not remain sharp. It softens, edges blur, details dissolve. Ancient cultures accepted this erosion as natural. What mattered was not preserving every feature of the past, but preserving enough of its shape to recognize when the present began to resemble it. This is why flood narratives and celestial warnings persist, even when their specifics contradict one another. The contradiction does not weaken them, it strengthens them. It reveals that the story is not bound to one place, one moment, or one explanation. It belongs to experience repeated under different conditions. The sky plays a central role in this repetition because it offers continuity amid change. Cities fall, languages vanish. Beliefs transform. The sky remains. When something unusual appears within it, memory stirs instinctively. The mind reaches backward, searching for precedent, not to copy the past, but to orient the present. The Anunnaki endure in this space between clarity and forgetting. They are remembered not because they explain events, but because they mark moments when explanation failed and attention became necessary. Their persistence reflects humanity's refusal to believe that disruption is meaningless, even when its cause cannot be fully grasped. Modern culture often treats memory as storage. Ancient cultures treated it as atmosphere. Memory shaped expectation, behavior, and restraint. It taught societies when to pause, when to prepare, and when to accept that some forces operate beyond negotiation. As this chapter closes, the listener is invited to notice how these ancient patterns still surface. They appear not only in moments of cosmic curiosity, but in quieter reflections about fragility, preparedness, and scale. They surface whenever certainty feels thinner than expected. The question is no longer whether ancient civilizations recorded celestial warnings. The question is why humanity continues to return to that possibility whenever the sky behaves unexpectedly. The answer may lie not in evidence, but in inheritance. Night settles again, as it has for countless generations, and the sky resumes its familiar silence. No message is delivered, no conclusion is offered. This, too, is part of the pattern ancient cultures understood well. The sky does not exist to reassure humanity, nor to threaten it. It exists independently, vast enough to remind each generation that permanence is an assumption, not a guarantee. Ancient observers learned to live with this reminder without demanding answers from it. Whether the Anunnaki recorded celestial warnings matters less than what their stories preserved. They preserved attentiveness. They preserved restraint. They preserved the understanding that cycles continue whether they are named or ignored. In every era, humanity stands briefly at the edge of awareness, looking up, sensing that stability is conditional. Most of the time, that sensation fades. Sometimes it is recorded. Rarely, it is carried forward long enough to shape behavior. This series does not ask for belief. It asks for remembrance, not remembrance of facts, but of posture, the calm willingness to notice, the patience to wait, the humility to accept that understanding unfolds slowly. As this chapter ends, nothing is resolved, because resolution was never its purpose. The cycle remains open, as it always has. Attention will awaken again, perhaps prompted by another object, another sign, another quiet interruption of routine. And when it does, the ancient memory will be there waiting, not as instruction, but as orientation. A reminder that beneath every familiar sky, change has always been possible, and that the simple act of noticing has been, across time, humanity's most enduring inheritance.